discussing the most cost-effective and value-added cybersecurity processes and best practices for the mortgage industry. My name is Kurt Blum. I'm in Richey May's Business Advisory Services. And before we dive into today's presentation, I just want to cover a few housekeeping items. First of all, for optimal audio, all participants' phones will be muted during the presentation. We will have a Q&A session at the end, and we do encourage your questions. And you can submit a question at any time during the presentation by using the question box feature. And then again at the end, our presenters will cover or try to address those questions as time permits. Secondly, we will post the presentation to our website afterwards. And in addition, all registrants will be emailed a copy of the slide deck. So with that being said, I'm very excited to introduce today's presenters on what is a very hot topic in our industry today. Both our presenters are managing partners with RedWolf Cybersecurity, which was established for the exclusive purpose of providing cybersecurity services to meet the specific needs of lenders across credit unions, mortgage, and banking sectors. So first, we're going to have Auzzie Brown, who has over 30 years experience in the IT and cybersecurity space, whose experience includes providing IT support to the President and Vice President of the United States. He's planned and established the U.S. Army's East Asia Cybersecurity Operations Center. Auzzie's also an Emeritus Executive Advisory Board member and served as a member and co-founder of Ellie Mae Incorporated. Secondly, we want to welcome Jordan Brown, who is a fintech industry leader with over 23 years of operational management, financial technology consulting, and system development experience. Jordan has led over 80 client engagement with money center banks, mortgage firms, commercial banks, and the vendor community. So with that being said, so we can dive right into the presentation, I'm now wanting to turn it over to Auzzie.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to also welcome everyone today, and again, I'd like to also express our appreciation to Richey May for collaborating with us on this presentation on such a critical issue that affects our industry in various different ways, but in terms of information security, it is pervasive in everything that we do in the business arena as well as our personal life. The agenda that I plan to cover today is I want to go over why security best practices are not optional, discuss the regulatory environment, discuss the business value, the business proposition of why organizations should engage in information security best practices, and put a face on the threat. What is this threat that we are continuously talking about? And then after discussing those things, present you with some ideas on cybersecurity best practices that you can implement in your organization, and go into a brief discussion on the decision to outsource versus insource to perform this critical function in your organization. Yeah. Because there are two bodies that have jurisdiction over this area of information security and privacy. The Federal Trade Commission is responsible for establishing security standards, and those standards say you shall establish an information security program, and the idea is that they are seeking for organizations to do is to anticipate the threats. And what that means is you have to have a strategy in place, basically knowing what your posture is, and because of the ever-changing environment, you've got to continue to evolve your information security program and make the necessary adjustments. Also, on the CFPB side, they focus on privacy. But the fact of the matter is you cannot protect the privacy of your customers' information if you don't have an effective information security program, because most of the information inside your organization moves across the technology. So you have to have the wrappers around that in order to make sure that's secure. The other key thing to mention here is that increasingly the FTC and the CFPB are actually working together. The CFPB has a responsibility, and the FTC, to share information that they receive out of these examinations, and they are beginning to share that information more aggressively because of the threat environment that we find ourselves in. In terms of, again, the jurisdiction, The CFPB is responsible for the privacy of customer information. They get their regulatory authority from Title V of the Graham-Lynch-Wiley Act. They do have required standards. In the examination manual, there are several questions that they ask about privacy. They also have the authority to levy penalties. In the case of the FTC, they're responsible for the security of the information to make sure that customers' non-public information is protected. And they get their authority from the 15 U.S.C. Code. And they too have a set of required standards that organizations, as I stated earlier, are supposed to comply with as it relates to information security. And they have the authority to levy fines. And in just a moment, I'll talk about one of the key fines that they just levied against Wyndham Hotel and Resorts that has major ramifications for the mortgage industry and all industries in the United States. In terms of the business value, what's the bottom line of business value of information security? Of course, there is this requirement where you have to comply, but the real value is the survivability of your organization. The Ponemon Institute, along with IBM, did an independent study this year, and their estimate in the United States alone, the cost of a breach is approximately $3.52 to $3.7 million. So again, when a small and medium-sized company has a breach, what that means is that you're tying up valuable resources in order to deal with that breach, and in terms of having to report to individual customers, in terms of the state regulations that go along with this, which can't be understated either, because you have to, every state pretty much has a different set of regulations as it relates to information security. So you're taking your focus off your daily productivity, as well as the legal costs and all the other additional costs that are associated with this. So it comes down to conserving resources. Organizations have a choice. You can either invest in developing a credible information security infrastructure to comply with the regulatory environment, or you can wait until a breach occurs, and then it's going to cost you significantly. As a matter of fact, most organizations that are small and mid-sized companies, a lot of those companies go out of business, and a good number of them never recover back to where they were before the breach. So you're faced with the choice of these fines and penalties, and also a loss of your customers because of the publicity that you'll get out of the breach. Another thing that we're telling folks is that this is now becoming an employee recruiting tool. So when you sit down and you're talking to a potential candidate, any candidate wants to know about the viability of a business. Are you going to be around tomorrow? So because folks are losing their jobs as a result of breaches, this now can become a marketing tool for organizations to say, hey, look, you know what? We have a very robust information security infrastructure. We are doing all the right things in terms of best practice to protect information, and essentially that's all you can do. It also offers a competitive marketing advantage, because when you're advertising your privacy and your information security policy, again, essentially one of the things that you're doing in today's environment, you're either instilling consumer confidence in what you're doing or not. But the key to this is, as I'll talk about here in just a moment, it's not enough just to have a written information security policy. That policy has to be mirrored by the things that you're doing actually inside the organization. And then, of course, there's brand and reputation. And the mortgage industry, we get a lot of questions about, well, what specific breaches have occurred in the mortgage industry to date? And I'll talk about those in just a moment. So in some instances, there is this belief when we talk to folks that, the mortgage industry is somehow immune from this, because you don't necessarily hear about it all the time. But I'll show you here that that's not the case. Another significant recent development just this week, as a matter of fact, which has been a major gap in terms of the public sector and the private sector working together to share information. There's legislation that is moving through the Congress in this latest stopgap bill that basically is going to provide liability protection to private sector organizations that share information with the government, because they're sharing threat information with you. Now, all of this hasn't been spelled out completely yet, and the bill hasn't made its way to the president's desk. It's anticipated that it's going to make its way to his desk, I think, either later this week or early next week. But this is significant because now, in addition to, for instance, the auditors coming into your organization and doing their assessment to see if you have a credible IT or cybersecurity infrastructure, one of the things that you can do is get ahead of the game. Once you get this liability protection, you can now, when you have a breach, report the breach, right? Feel comfortable that you're not going to be punished for it, right? And then move on. The impetus for cybersecurity best practices. This year, it's reported that approximately 62% of the cyber breach victims are small to mid-sized businesses. And there's a reason for that. The reason for it is the hacktivists are always going to take the path of least resistance. A good majority of the companies that are small and mid-sized companies, first of all, don't even know that they have been breached. But if you don't have adequate firewalls, if your people don't have training and they're not looking for these the symptoms and signs of what you should be looking for to protect yourself against a breach, then again, you're putting yourself at risk here. Another recent development that is a memorandum that just came out from the state of New York. And in many instances, so goes New York, being the financial capital of the world in the United States, and also I would add California to that mix. What they have determined in the state of New York, their auditors have been out there looking at organizations, mortgage companies, retail companies, you name it, the whole spectrum. And what they are saying is that these organizations are woefully not prepared in terms of having a credible and effective information security program in their organization. So they have taken the step to actually write the CFPB in addition to the FTC and also the FTC and all of the bodies that regulate finance here in the United States and call for more regulation. The significance of this is that this is not going to go away anytime soon. As a matter of fact, it's going to become even more aggressive as we move forward into the future here. And this white paper that just recently came out from the Mortgage Bankers Association, and the idea behind that paper that they published, what they wanted to do was give organizations some tools and some recommendations on things that they could do in terms of improving their information security posture. And as a part of this white paper, what they talk about now are the criminal, civil, and statutory and the regulatory the penalties that are probably going to increase going forward. Jordan and I had a conversation with a member of the NBA, a key member of the NBA, approximately 3 weeks ago. And as most of you all know, these folks are in constant communication with the CFPB. And their takeaway from those discussions is exactly what I just said, that the regulatory intensity will increase around this area. Now, I mentioned to you earlier I wanted to talk about a key case, and that was the FTC versus Wyndham Resorts. What happened in this case is the FTC actually was auditing Wyndham, and what they discovered is that Wyndham was not making a real effort in terms of protecting customer privacy information. What they opted to do was to sue Wyndham. Wyndham pushed back and said the FTC did not have the authority to sue them for not having a credible cybersecurity program in place. And just recently, here in August, it went to the appellate level, and the FTC won that case. The significance of that case is this. Most organizations, and this is a typical mortgage privacy statement that we see across the industry, which you're required to publish this on your websites and other documentation. And we see organizations that say we use security measures that comply with the federal law. And really what they're saying with that is that they are meeting the standards that the CFPB, the FTC, and Greenwich-Wiley have stated that they have to meet. So if you're putting this statement out there and the auditors come into your organization and they discover that what you're advertising to the public is not what you're doing inside the organization, that there's an inconsistency there, basically what happens is they can actually fine you for deceptive practices. So you have to ask yourself a question. When you look at your privacy and security statement, is it reflective of what you're doing inside your organization? Because this court case has opened up an entire can of worms where now the CFPB, while they don't have the authority that the FTC has, what they do have is, similar to the FTC, is the ability to fine organizations for deceptive practices. So they're looking at this case while collaborating with the FTC and sharing information. Again, what we see is, again, a more aggressive approach in terms of evaluating your information security posture. The face of the threat. You know, oftentimes we talk to organizations and people say, well, what does this threat look like? What is the threat? Well, there's actually three main threats that you have to contend with in the mortgage industry, in any industry. You've got the advanced persistent threat. The goal of this APT, these are social engineering attempts to convince or trick your employees into giving a hacker access to information that they shouldn't have access to, commonly called a phishing email. And the goal of this is to steal data. Early on in this business, maybe 5, 10, 15 years ago, one of the objectives were to deny an organization service. But what the hacktivists has figured out is that obviously credit cards and other information are extremely valuable. But one thing that, again, I also need to emphasize here, the specific or unique position that the mortgage industry is in as it relates to this threat. I often tell people, right, being a retired military officer for 24 years, I was investigated by the FBI. I was at least 5 times, and I had a top secret security clearance. And the only difference in terms of the information that the FBI collected on me versus the mortgage industry was they did a character background check. So if I am a hacker, the mortgage industry is basically a rich opportunity for me as it comes to stealing consumers' information, because you guys have the majority of it compared to other industries. Now, the other threat is the insider threat. This is a double-edged sword. You've got the insider threat where you have individuals who may be doing malicious things, and you also have the insider threat where people are doing things that are unintended consequences because they just don't have the knowledge of what they should be doing as it relates to protecting your information. And I want to stress, right, there's a lot of people that will say that this is a technical problem. The majority of this problem is a human behavior problem. It's about education and awareness and training your people, right, on what to look for, right, on what's important, right, and how to protect information. Now, of course, you're always going to have the rogue individual who's going to do bad things. So that's the nature of the insider threat. And then you get into the external threat. This is where you have a third-party vendor that you may be working with, and you may be sharing information. They may be affiliated or non-affiliated with you. And again, these folks, third-party vendors, have got to be held to the same standards as the employees in your organization. What I tell people all the time is that the set of information security policies and procedures that you have in your organization, the third-party vendors have to comply with those same set of procedures so that you don't have a scene between the third-party vendor and your employees in the organization. So those are the 3 key threats that you face in the industry today. Now, the question becomes, and we get this all the time, right? Well, tell me some of the mortgage organizations or recent cybersecurity breaches in the mortgage industry. Well, here's a few for you. You got HSBC, which had a breach in April of this year. You've got Homestead up in New York that had a breach in June of this year. And there's a significant point that I want to make here. Obviously, New Hampshire, you've got New York. Once again, pretty much each state across this nation has its own individual information security standards. And from what we've seen, a good majority of those have some unique things in those standards that are not contained in ground lease quality and what the CFPB and what the FTC is looking at. So what this means is this issue really gets very complicated in a hurry, because you're talking about having to satisfy the federal regulators, and then if you're operating in multiple states, now you're having to satisfy multiple different state regulators. Now, what's the significance of that? And I want to be very careful here, but it's not hard to draw conclusions here. States are really, their budgets are very constrained. Okay? As a matter of fact, a lot of the states across the United States are operating in the red. So recognizing that this problem exists in terms of organizations not complying, this actually becomes a revenue stream for them to look at your organization, and when they find fault, obviously, to begin to fine. Just something to think about. Yeah. The other recent case, which actually occurred by the SEC, the significance of this is that, and I'll just read this, the SEC's action, along with those last month at the Federal Trade Commission and in federal courts, is starting to sketch out a pattern of dwindling tolerance for negligence by companies. Once again, the interagencies are beginning to share information and work together. So again, the point that I'm trying to make here is that organizations that are trying to fly below the radar and avoid putting in a credible information security program, that's only going to last for so long. Now, what's the outcome? What can be the possible outcome if you are found negligent? Well, Superior Mortgage Corporation actually was found negligent, and this actually happened back in 2005, actually, by the way. And what the FTC did was they actually put them on a 10-year probation. So now you've got the possibility of having the regulatory oversight, again, being in your organization on a continuous basis, consisting on the things that you have to do in terms of establishing an information security program and maintaining that program. Another recent breach, again, to make the point that the mortgage industry definitely is not immune from this. This is a good example of the insider threat, where at Mount Olympus, which was a 38-person mortgage company, you had individuals and stuff that basically bolted for another mortgage company, and they tried to take the information, download the information in terms of the customer information, and take that information with them. The key point here is that when you're talking about having an information security program, right, you've got to know where all of your data is at. You got to have a plan on what data is important to you. And again, you got to know who has access to your data. Okay? Now, we've talked about, the regulatory environment. We've talked about the business value of having an information security program. And so now what I want to talk about are some of the risk mitigation strategies that you can put in place in order to cope with this threat. So, what does a best practice mortgage information security strategy look like? First of all, you've got to have a set of mortgage policies and procedures. And I specify mortgage because similar to the healthcare industry, where there are things that are unique to that industry, there are definitely things that are unique to the mortgage industry. So what we mean by that is that your policies and procedures, they have to be interestingly linked back into what Graham-Smiley is asking you to comply with and what the CFPB and the FTC is going to be looking at when they come into your organization to do an audit. See, and also, that helps you satisfy the requirement of having a written program. One of the things that is called for by the CFPB, the FTC, all the way back to Graham-Smiley, is that you've got to have a written program. The second thing that you got to have, or you must do, is a risk assessment and a risk maturity assessment. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in just a moment. But what that means is, if you don't know what your posture is today, there's really no way that you can move forward, right, and also make the informed decisions that you need to make. So essentially what you do is you do a risk assessment, you find out where your gaps are, and then you prioritize those risks. Based on my experience working in the banking industry and also in the mortgage industry, here's what happens when an audit takes place. The auditors come in, they look at all those things they're looking at, and if you're able to show them that you have done your risk assessment and that you have a strategy in place, right, that normally satisfies them. And the reason why, specifically in this area of information security, that has to satisfy them, is because that is best practice, because the threat is ever changing. It's very unrealistic for someone to think that you will have an ironclad, finite cybersecurity program, and that's the end of it. You must continue to adjust. So it has to be acceptable if you prioritize your risk, you have basically assigned the resources against that, and you're continuing to evaluate. The other thing that this risk assessment should eventually produce is you've got to start looking forward, right, and actually becoming proactive in terms of actually receiving threat intelligence or information on the threat so that you can continue to do this risk assessment on a recurring basis. The other item that you've got to have is a mortgage employee awareness and training program, what we call a cyber quiz. This is very much similar to the anti-money laundering. For instance, there's this anti-money laundering quiz that's offered by some organizations that the mortgage industry takes every year, I think it is. What we're saying is that you've got to do the same thing when it comes to information security. This quiz is the most significant thing, or education program is the most significant and immediate thing that an organization can do, and it offers the best ROI, because the objective is, once you educate your people, right, number one, they're aware of the threat. Number two, when the auditors come in and they pull 3 or 4 people into the room and they do an interview, basically you have level set their knowledge and stuff inside the organization. And the objective is, what you want to do is you want to affect the behavior of your employee. One of the things that I have been successful at doing when I was in corporate is just that, creating this environment, this culture that convinces the employees that there is no delineation in their personal life when you're talking about protecting information and in the corporate environment. Again, getting rid of that demarcation. And what does this all equate to? It will equate to regulatory compliance to protect your customers' non-public information. It's going to give you that business value that we talked about earlier. And it's also going to give you the information security best practices that are consistent with the Federal Financial Institutions Evaluation Council's guidelines, which I'll talk about a little bit later in this briefing. Now, the cybersecurity risk assessment and maturity best practice process. Again, how do you go about, this assessment process in your organization, finding the gaps that you need to find, right, and then building your platform and then moving forward, continue to evolve it? Well, it starts with the risk assessment. It's after you do the risk assessment, as I said earlier, then you have to prioritize the risk and you develop a long-term strategy. And then, of course, you get into a cycle of remediation. Once again, you can't fix everything at one time. Information security is a journey, not a destination. So you set your priorities. And then the most important part of all of this is the cyber risk management maintenance. So once you start the cycle, you have to continue to do this. Our recommendation is that you really do this on a quarterly basis. And actually, that's a little conservative because the threat is changing even as we speak here today. So you need to really evaluate this very frequently. Now, what do you get out of this risk assessment? You're going to look at your policy documents on a continuous basis, a technology review, because in some instances, what you may find with your technology, you may have legacy technology that basically is not capable of defending against the threat. You also may discover that your technology platform may be so porous until information security may not do you any good, which means obviously you need to do something about that. And you do an annual cybersecurity review. Once again, at a minimum, we say you should do an annual cybersecurity review. You get a strategy out of this, and of course you start implementing the strategy, and then you start moving into obviously the more sophisticated levels of information security, where you're really on the day-to-day part. You have to start bringing in threat intelligence, right, to see exactly what the threat is, what actions do I need to take in order to defend against the threat. And of course, the final piece that you're going to get out of this is incident management. How are you going to handle a breach inside your organization when it happens? A good majority of organizations that are small and mid-sized don't have a plan. So basically, if you don't have a plan, you're basically swinging for the fences, and you're actually, again, in the case of an incident, it actually ties up your resources. It's very resource intensive because you're dealing with this, and now you got to deal with the public. You also got to deal with continued production inside your organization. So you can imagine if you don't have a plan to deal with this chaos, right, you're actually struggling through this process. Now, the policies and procedures. The FTC requires that you must have a documented program. The CFPB requires that you have this documented program. But what does this mean? You need the written program really to establish the foundation to meet the regulatory requirements. And there are primarily three areas that you got to deal with. You got to cover the people, the processes, and the technology in your organization. And I'll just give you a couple of examples of what I mean. I'll give you an example of what I mean for each of these. The people aspect. The FTC says that you should designate an individual that's responsible for information security inside your organization. The reason why that's so important is because it actually reduces your risk to the threat, probably in the area of about 20%, just having someone who is responsible. The other people aspect is at the managerial or the executive level, you should have an enterprise risk committee. So you have your overarching enterprise risk committee, but then you should also have a slice of that for information security so that on a continuous basis, these issues are being brought to the table and they're being addressed and prioritized. In the area of processes, a good example of that is your procurement process. You procure technologies that transmit, store, and receive data. From the front end of receiving that piece of equipment to its end of life, if it's going to do one of those three things, you actually need to track that piece of equipment because if you don't, then you're losing control of your data and you're losing control of the privacy aspects in terms of your consumer information if consumer information is being stored or transmitted on that device. From a technology standpoint, a good example of a policy is what I said earlier, incident management. Do you have a disaster recovery / incident management program in place in the event that you have a breach? The other areas of the policy aspect is, are you following those practices outlined in your policies and procedures? So it's not just enough to get these policies, to get them documented, right? Because the FTC is going to be looking, and now the CFPB working together with them, right? Okay, you said that you are tracking this inventory from end to end. Show me that you're doing that. So your words, your actions must match your words. Are the policies and procedures aligned with the Greenwich Act privacy and security requirements? Again, I stated earlier, right? The healthcare has their special needs. I'm sure the auto industry had their special needs, and so does the mortgage industry. So it's not enough to just go snag some policies and procedures from somewhere on the internet and say, okay, you know, that will suffice. Are they current and relevant to cope with the threat environment? Again, the policies must be continuously updated so that you can demonstrate that your organization is postured to deal with the threat. The Employee Cybersecurity Training and Awareness Program. Once again, I cannot overstate how important this is. 35% of the problem is a people problem. Nearly every breach that has happened, every major breach, is generally traced back to an individual. And the individual made a mistake. A good example is something we call a candy drop, which is something I've done in organizations just to test the effectiveness of my information security program. You drop a bunch of thumb drives in the parking lot, and employees will pick those thumb drives up and take them into the organization and plug them into their desktop or their laptop. Once again, if you educate your employees that, hey, look, there's a reason why you can't do that, okay? Or you educate them on phishing emails, what they look like. There is nothing wrong with an individual opening up a phishing email, okay? Now, that sounds like a contradiction being an information security professional, but let me explain to you what I mean by that. When a phishing email is sent to an organization, what that hacker is looking for is, again, some information, some valuable information. What generally happens is it takes about 30 days for them to map out your network, or somewhere between 2 weeks and 30 days, to map out your network to figure out what they want to steal and how they want to steal it, okay? So when the individual opens up a phishing email, what you want them to immediately do is to report that to the management so that the management can deal with that, because now they have time to deal with it. So you got to educate them on these types of things. The other thing that the quiz has to address is it has to address all levels of employees in your organization, the executives, the managers, the supervisors, and the employees. Because unless all of those folks are working together, you're really going to have a bad day as it relates to information, as it relates to breaches. And it needs to address the regulatory requirements and security best practices. So there's a combination of the education being about why are you doing this in terms of the compliance and stuff that folks need to be educated on. And then there's the core information security things that are just general standard best practices like password protection, locking up your documents at the end of the day, right? Or reporting strange phone calls. All these things are basic best practices. So it's a combination of those things that makes a great education program. And again, the objective is to encourage employee behavior to engage in best practices. And what's the so what of doing this? What you want to be able to do, number one, is about the survivability of your business. Number two, you want to be able to demonstrate to the auditors and the regulators that you have a culture of cybersecurity compliance. So what you want to be able to do is to give these folks a very simple quiz and educate them, and you want them to be successful at it. And what you want to do is record that training. So when the auditors come in, you can present this file to them and you can say, hey, all of my people have gone through information security training, and you've got the proof. When they call them in to do interviews, once again, those key employees that they call in, They're all speaking the same language, and they're basically giving back to the auditor what the auditor is looking for as it relates to compliance with information security and privacy. Okay. Now, I mentioned to you earlier that I would talk to you about the FFIEC and the new guidelines that they published back in June, I think it was, which, by the way, I think is a very good framework. And the reason why I say that is because it's rooted in the new NIST cybersecurity standards model. And the way that they've laid it out is, again, in two areas. They've laid it out to identify inherent risks that you're faced with in your organization, and I'll give you an example of that. I'll use technologies and connection types. Wi-Fi is a good example. So that's an inherent risk if you have Wi-Fi in your network, and I'll go into a little bit more detail about what I mean by that in just a moment. Now, the domain areas. They've identified all of these domain areas in addition to the inherent risk. So you've got inherent risks, let's say Wi-Fi, but then on governance, you've got to have policies and procedures. You've got to have education and training to create this culture that you're looking for, and I'm only going to go over a few of these. And then threat intelligence. Do you have a means to receive updated information security information on the threat? A good one that I like to recommend to people is the U.S. CERT program, which is headed up by DHS. Subscribe to that. Incident resilience planning and strategy. So do you have a strategy, right, that's going to allow you to deal with a breach when that breach occurs? So again, there's a host of these domain areas that they talk about, but for the purpose of this briefing, the time that I have, I just want to give you some example or sample of what this means in terms of this model. And I told you that I was going to talk to you about, give you an example using Wi-Fi, what they mean by the domain areas and the inherent risk. So in your organization, you may have Wi-Fi. So once again, that's an inherent risk. But when you start looking at the maturity level, does that Wi-Fi network, right, connect to your business network? And that may be okay, but if it connects to your business network, does it have the security apparatuses around it that it needs to have? Go a little bit further. So you've got a corporate Wi-Fi network, but then you've got a visitor Wi-Fi network. Again, if you had a visitor Wi-Fi network, do you have a policy that that person who is using that network, when they visit your organization, that they have to comply with? When you issue a password to that individual, right, is that person taken out of the system when they leave the building? So all of these things represent the maturity of the inherent risk, for instance, with Wi-Fi. Okay? Now, I said I was going to talk to you earlier about the cost of in-house staffing versus outsourcing this requirement. So the question becomes, should you insource information security staff? Well, most medium and small organizations, they will find it very difficult, for the most part, to be able to afford a full-up information security staff. On average, annually, it's going to cost you somewhere between $700K and $1 million a year to have such a staff. And then it's estimated that these salaries will continue to increase somewhere between 6 to 7% annually. So this is I'm not telling anybody what to do here, but what I'm saying, this is the decision that an organization has to make. The other thing that I would say about the staffing piece is it's a very competitive environment for these individuals today, and to be quite honest with you, it would be very difficult for a small and medium-sized organization to actually find these individuals, because most of them are being scooped up by the larger organizations because they have the resources to do it. So in conclusion, what is the so what of all of this? First of all, protecting your customer data is the lifeblood of your organization. It's only second to the employees in your organization. That's just the reality of it. Employee security awareness training. Again, I want to stress that it's, again, one of the most effective things that you can do, the least expensive, and offers you the greatest ROI, and it's something that you can do very quickly. Finally, the severity and frequency of the breaches is going to increase. If you look at the current environment, right, companies are underreporting breaches. Companies are unaware that they have been breached. So what is the one thing that the regulators can control? The one thing that they can control in order to protect and attempt to protect consumers' non-public information is the audit to see if you are complying with the FTC and the CFPB overall Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act as it relates to information security. The ever-changing threat and compliance environment requires a strategy. Again, if you're going to have a credible program, you've got to continue to do the initial risk assessment and continue to do the assessment. You got to prioritize those risks and assign the resources against them, and then you have to have a remediation process in place. Remember what I said earlier about the auditors coming in, and my experience has been if you've got a strategy and you can show them that strategy, what you're demonstrating is a commitment to a cybersecurity culture. The individual, remember that, yes, the federal regulations are applicable here, and you've got to comply with that, but keep in mind that every state pretty much has a separate regulation for information security with different standards contained within that. And I'll give you an example. In the state of California, when there is a breach of 500 records or more, that organization is required to report that breach to the Attorney General. Okay? At the federal level, there's no law that requires you to report a breach, but what you have to do is you have to report to the individual customers, which can be even more costly because ideally you want to do a one-shot information brief to all of your customers via some type of media, right? But now you got to do once and Tuesday at the federal level. And finally, I love to tell people all the time that I'm not a heart surgeon. Okay, if you're looking for a heart surgeon, you got the wrong guy. Really, it's not going to work. This is a very complex landscape in terms of dealing with information security today, and I would highly recommend that organizations, small and mid-sized, engage the professionals as you're moving through to determine your to put in place your risk mitigation efforts. And that concludes my briefing, folks. Thanks for listening, and I'll turn it back over to Richey May.
Thanks, Auzzie. I really appreciate it. I know that we ran out of time a little bit, but we're going to go ahead and extend our webinar for an additional 10 to 15 minutes to answer some questions. And if somebody does have a hard stop and they're unable to stay on, we will have the guys, Auzzie and Jordan, reach out to you offline to answer any questions. So at this time, I'm just going to turn it back over to Auzzie and Jordan to review and answer any questions that you guys may have. Auzzie, it does look like Auzzie and Jordan, it does look like there's a question in here that says, how does a company deal with the interpretive aspects of GLB, specifically of similar scope and scale?
Can you clarify that just a little bit more? Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here, but I'm just reading the question that was posed. So the question again, how does a company deal with the interpretive aspects of Gramm-Leach-Bliley, specifically?
Well, if I think I understand the question, here's what I understand what's being asked. They do not prescribe exactly how much.
Muted.
Well, hello? 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 Hello?
Auzzie, we can hear you.
Okay, I didn't know you could hear me. I'm sorry. I was saying, if I interpret the question correctly, here's what I think is being asked. How much security is enough security as it relates to Ground and Squad Act? Well, one of the smart things that they did with the regulation was they didn't specify exactly, right, how much you need to do as it relates to information security. But what I would say is that you got to take a look at the FTC requirements in terms of what they have established as their standards as it relates to information security. And also, I would recommend that you take a look at the FFIEC requirements. And I'm comfortable in saying that if you follow those two things and stuff, that you'll do just fine.
Great, thank you. Well, I don't see any other questions being asked by the attendees, but if you do have questions after the fact, the email addresses will be provided, and you can reach out to Auzzie and Jordan directly, and they can work with you. So just in conclusion, I want to thank everyone for attending the webinar today, and a special thank you to Auzzie and Jordan for putting together the presentation and being a part of our webinar. Again, if you want to submit a question, feel free to reach out to them, and they'll be able to get back with you offline after this webinar. Also, we're always trying to provide topics that are both timely and informative in today's environment. So if you have ideas for future topics that you'd like to have considered, please email them to us at info@richeymay.com. And finally, just a reminder that the audio portion of the webinar will get posted to our website in the next day or two, and that all registrants of this webinar will receive a copy of the slide deck. So that being said, thanks again to everyone, and thanks again to Auzzie and Jordan, and hope you guys have a great day.
Thank you very much.